Hello and welcome to the latest in the extremely timely Sonic Spaces seminar series supported by the Trinity College Long Room of Arts and Humanities Research Institute and created by Jennifer O'Mara. In tonight's session, we're exploring culture on the radio. I'm Luke Clancy and I'm here to introduce a panel that has been involved in shaping culture on the radio, both as practitioners and as researchers. Our first speaker tonight is Nerys Williams, who's an associate professor in poetry and poetics at University College Dublin. She's the author of Contemporary Poetry 2011, and her third collection of poetry, Republic, is due out in 2023. Nerys has been researching poets on air, producing poetry at the BBC, which looks at the collaborative relationship between poets and radio producers at the BBC's third programme. Over to you, Nerys.
Great, thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen here. So let's get this working. Okay, that should be clear. Right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a little bit, give you a history of a collaboration between my producer, D.G. Brydson. I feel I've got to know him through the archive, and the American poet Langston Hughes. Now, in 1938, Herbert Reed wrote an open letter to the BBC in new verse lobbying for the inclusion of poets as broadcasters. And this is what he stated: in broadcasting, it would be possible to reinvent poetry in a new bardic manner, removing it from the taint of ink and the literary field. In 1946, the BBC launched the third programme, a broadcast space which actively promoted new and experimental writing for radio. Now, my research, and this is all going towards a book project eventually, but my research at the moment considers how BBC producers collaborated with poets at the third programme to create works which pushed the limits and expectations of a more traditional poetry reading audience. New commissioned productions were highly radiogenic, alert to strategies of oral reception and sonic performance. And radio poets were also attuned to radio's potential as a disseminator of new cultural commentaries and narratives of political change. So in the time allotted, I want to touch on the collaboration between these two gentlemen, D.G. Brydson and Langston Hughes. Through Brydson's instigation, Hughes was approached as co-editor of this ambitious 19-part radio series, The Negro in America. And just to flag that I'll be using the language that was used to describe and entitle the work at that time and used by Hughes himself throughout this paper as well. So, this series was broadcast in autumn 1964, and my own attention will be on Hughes as a radio anthologist and a programme that he produced called Negro Poetry Today. Now, the premise of the collaboration might initially seem quite unusual because Brydson was very attentive to a specific strand of Anglo-American modernism made evident through his close friendships with Wyndham Lewis and Ezra Pound. And Hughes and Brydson themselves nurtured a very strong friendship, and that should be reiterated. So looking at archive material, BBC audience reports and sound studies, I'm interested in how Hughes's poetry and poetics were introduced to, and also importantly, received by a UK listening audience. In 1952 then, Langston Hughes was asked to respond to a questionnaire from the chair of the Committee on Blacklisting, Authors League of America. And in his reply, Hughes states sardonically, Negro writers being black have always been blacklisted in radio and TV. Only once in a blue moon are any coloured writers given an opportunity to do a script, and then usually with no regularity and no credits. Hughes adds that in his 25 years of writing, he has only been asked to do 4 or 5 commercial one-shot scripts, which produced no immediate additional jobs or requests. He mentions that one of these scripts was for the BBC and was done around the broadcast around the world with an all-star cast, but no American stations offered me work. The programme that Hughes is referring to is this one here, The Man Who Went to War, and it was a wartime radio ballad drama commissioned and produced by D.G. Brightson and broadcast on March the 6th, 1944. Now, this was their first collaboration, and the opening featured Paul Robeson with music under the direction of Hall Johnson and Alan Lomax. And Brightson comments that he wanted to produce an African-American musical written around a war. I realised that the script would have to be a collaboration, unless it was to run this risk of striking a false note, the very last thing that I wanted. And I had no doubt at all who my collaborator should be. Brightson had been a long-time admirer of Hughes's poetry, but they were finally introduced during a trip to New York in 1943 by a mutual friend, the folk historian Alan Lomax, who I've already mentioned. Now, in considering the processes of collaboration between poet and producer for this later series in '64, The Negro in America, we're reminded that as co-editor, Hughes was an indispensable viewfinder for the BBC production. Brightson sought Hughes's inclusion, not only as a poet and a dramatist, but as a cultural curator and a commentator who could serve as a political barometer during the continuing battle for civil rights. As a way into understanding the complexities of this programming, its reception, as well as its groundbreaking role in British radio, I'll just sketch an overview of how Hughes curated the anthology programme, which was called Negro Poetry and was broadcast on 29th of September 1964. There are 19 programmes in this series in all, but I'm just going to focus on the poetry programme very briefly. Now, the BBC audience listening reports to the whole series of 19 programmes gives us an insight to the expectations of the UK public. This history of the reception of the Negro in America allows us to examine how listening itself is racialized to create delineation of identities, which Jennifer Stover has referred to as the sonic colour line. And this comes from her book. This idea of how and why certain bodies are expected to produce, desire, and live amongst particular sounds, and its product, the hierarchical division sounded between whiteness and blackness. The listening ear drives the sonic colour line. It is a figure for how dominant listening practices accrue and change over time. And this intersects with conditions and expectations that Beth Lafredo and Claudia Rankin have referred to as the racial imaginary, which is defined as something we all recognise quite easily, the way our culture has imagined over and over again the narrative opportunities, the feelings and attributes and situations, the subjects and metaphors and forms and voices available to both characters of different races and their authors. Now, at the series' inception, James Baldwin was suggested as an advisor and a participant. But in a letter to Lilian Lang, the head of the BBC's New York office, Brightson makes it clear that he's lobbying for Hughes's inclusion on the production of the programme as co-editor. Now, Brightson felt it necessary to explore Hughes's political standing in the African-American community before suggesting him as a curator of the series. And this is the material that I found through memos at the BBC archives, but also there's a very good programme which has been done by Professor Hendy, which looks at a little bit of the history of the production of the series at the third programme. And Brightson, in a memo, asks Lang, I would like your advice and confidence as to the current standing of Langston Hughes within the Negro movement. I would like to have him as a co-editor and advisor on the series. Brightson emphasised that as a friend and a writer, he considers Hughes the best possible contact for securing the cooperation of all leading Black artists. And this is Lang's response here. So I'll just show up this slide that I have here. And this is a passport that I managed to get of Geoffrey Brydson in the Lilly Library. His name has not been forgotten in the demonstrations, but as you know, he writes a column for the New York Post in which he deals with the situation. You will be interested to know that the whole new vocabulary is building up, and we do not find that Langston was a sleeping beauty. The BBC clearly sought from its editors and presenters a curious mix of political endeavour and impartiality from political bodies. Lang confirms that Hughes is not involved with any particular group, i.e. NAACP, CORE, etc., which would make him ideal for your purposes. Bryson's letter to Langston at the close of the year confirms the approval of the series and stresses the prestige of the project. And interestingly, he emphasises the audience that being on the third programme would enable Langston Hughes to touch. He talks about the intellectuals who form the listening audience of the third. And we know that by January the 6th, Hughes has confirmed his interest in the project. Now, in thinking about, to close here, and thinking about the anthologizing of the New Negro Poets programme itself, Hughes had complete editorial control over this poetry anthology. And this is something I think which is kind of underestimated with Langston Hughes' work, his role as an anthologist for African-American poetry. It included the work of 12 leading contemporary poets, Helen Morgan Brooks, Gwendolyn Brooks, Sterling Brown, Anna Bontemp, Margaret Danner, Samuel Allen, Jay Wright, Maury Evans, James A. Emanuel, Amiri Baraka, who was then called Leroy Jones before he took his Muslim name, and also Hughes himself. And many of the poems were published that same year in an anthology co-edited by Hughes with Gwendolyn Brooks, The New Negro Poets, USA, 1964. So he's very much, this was he was acting as producer of this specific program. Now, I'm going to end here with thinking about the listening reports. This is a BBC listening report. They're very, very, very interesting. I'm going to try and formulate what use they may have in thinking about the racial politics of the BBC, but how listeners themselves were racialized as well in their listening habits. The Negro in America's running order was altered at the last minute. The second program of the series was due to be a recording of In White America by Martin B. Duberman. However, the last minute had to be withdrawn for copyright reasons. And looking at the responses, we can see it has given an appreciation index of 54. The average for poetry readings in the third program during the first half of the year was 62. And here are some of the comments. I can't show you everything. The BBC are very careful about their copyright and how they display things, but I'll just read out some comments which struck me. The general feeling about the selection of verses, what they would not notably impressive quality through as a whole. They had a certain interest as an evocation of the thoughts and ideas of contemporary American writers. Detailed comment was usually of an isolated kind, individual listeners maintaining by turns that some of the pieces had a fine simplicity and were pleasing to the ear, while others sounded crude and unmusical or seemed no more than puerile word-making with little sense or rhythm. One listener thought that this was much nearer to prose than poetry. It was also observed once or twice that despite the different styles and approaches, the content of the poems offered little contrast of theme and being mainly an anthology, and this is crucial, of bitterness. So, what can we conclude? What can I conclude from this? This brief foray into Hughes's work at the third programme. The general sense is that the anthology programme is a collection of protest poetry only, and hence the minimising of artistic merit, strategies of techniques and aesthetic. So what we can conclude from these reports, with its complex subject and also the reception and circulation of listening. And here I'm turning to the media scholar, Bala Baptist. African Americans' involvement in radio is under-theorized and lacks sufficient generalizations. Scholarship concerning Blacks in broadcasting needs more insight and detail that allow individuals better to explain relevant social behavior. Scholars have for decades produced historical research regarding white men and women as broadcast station owners and content producers and consumers. I think then coming into play, and this is the difficulty of using the archive and approaching the BBC archive, is that you really have to think about the materials that you're dealing with considerable care, to consider the boundary of the colour line, in this case, how BBC listening reports can belatedly instruct us, since this was not their original intention, about the necessity of acknowledging racialized listening processes and, in relation to that, race prejudice. With a because this is about sound, I'm just going to play you a very small excerpt from a roundtable that involved
connected to Louise's iPhone.
Excuse the sound. A roundtable African-American writing, which featured Alice Childress, James Baldwin, and Amiri Baraka as part of the greater series, The Negro in America. And this scored 68 out of 70. But all the participants are reflecting upon this difficulty of it being seen as protest writing, or as being seen as somehow overstepping a kind of a political boundary. So this is a short burst, starts off with Langston Hughes, moves to Amiri Baraka, and then ends with James Baldwin. And I'll close it on their words.
Pathetic. Well, art, of course, has the tendency to make almost everything seem larger than life. That's perhaps why it is art, if it's effective art. I myself have been writing for 40 years about the plight of the Negro in America, and I have very often been called a propaganda writer. Well, in the old days, that was considered a rather bad word, but my feeling is that art and propaganda can be one and the same thing. Yes, Leroy, would you know?
No, I was going to say, in that sense, you can call Dante a propagandist for certain kind of values, certain kind of moral fix on the world. But it's just that certain people, if they disagree with your attitudes, then they're going to call it propaganda. And by calling it propaganda, what they mean is it has no artistic value simply because it's about something they disagree with. But that's,
Well, when art is related to social values and related to attempts to change a social system,
it can't be.
Pattern.
I don't think it can be taken out of its social. I mean, art exists in the world like everything else, and it has a social connotation. It has a social direction, whether the writer admits it or is conscious of it or not. It exists as a socially oriented kind of expression. It cannot help that. It exists in the world like everything else.
Yes,
as a social act, or rather what is called an antisocial act.
but I myself think that many Negro writers are social or are propaganda writers without consciously being so, due to the very fact of their situation in our society. Would you not?
Okay, I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Neris. Absolutely fascinating contribution. Amazing to hear Amiri Baraka there talking about a kind of resistance to dealing with social questions in art and how persistent maybe that is. Terrific piece. Thank you very much. And also to the fore there was the idea of how much collaboration is involved in putting culture on the radio. And I think that will become even more clear with our next speakers. And next up, we have Fiona Hallinan and Kate Strain, who work together and are co-founders of the Department of Ultimology. Fiona's an artist and researcher and a PhD student at Lucas School of the Arts in Leuven, Belgium, while Kate is, among other things, artistic director of the Grazer Kunstverein in Austria. The Department of Ultimology is their joint project exploring endings, from practices passing into irrelevance, redundancy, or extinction to death itself. Recently, they collaborated with radio producer Kevin Brew to create a broadcast elaboration of that project. So over to you to tell us more about that, Fiona Hallinan and Kate Strain.
Hi, thank you so much, Luke, for that introduction, and thank you to Jennifer O'Mara and Francesco Rafferty for having us here today. Yes, so Kate and I, as you mentioned, Luke, work together in the collaborative practice that we call the Department of Ophthalmology. And nearly 3 years ago now, 2019, we were approached by Kevin Brew, producer for RTE Drama on One, to create a radio essay, which was a kind of transference of an event and project that we'd been working on, which was actually hosted in the Trinity Long Room Hub as well. So Kate and I began with this speculative proposition that there should be a department to study endings in the university, in Trinity College Dublin. And we set about interviewing people, asking them from their perspective across the university what was ending, obsolete, extinct, endangered, or dying out in their field. And out of those interviews, we put together a sort of series of outputs, one of which was a conference in the Long Room Hub, which we decided to kind of transfer to this radio essay, but also to use it as a platform to draw upon further research that we'd been doing subsequently. Kate, would you like to speak a little bit about the conference?
I'd love to. So the conference was originally envisaged as a kind of exhibition. So an exhibition in the form of a conference. And so one of the things that did immediately for the guests and visitors of the conference was unsettle a little bit the feeling of whether this might be something that was purely academic or purely artistic, or crossing the border between both the fictional and the real. And this is something we really like to do as the Department of Ophthalmology, is tread that border very carefully and delicately, because of course everything that's made up is also real. And so despite it being a speculative project, it was also of course a very real project and a real kind of research question. So this is something we mirrored then with the radio essay, because it was presented as part of the Drama on One series. So we dramatized what had been the bones of the conference. And that was done as a way to kind of try to get into this speculative world again, where there's a little bit of uncertainty over whether what we're listening to is fact or fiction.
Yeah, so I would like to play a few excerpts from the radio essay as we speak today. And the first one here, this is also, I think it was an idea of Kevin's. And I think Kate and I are both so in awe of Kevin Brew's particular way of producing, and the way that the radio essay came about was for us a really transformative process as individuals and as artists and as curators. Kevin worked with us as producer, but also in this really collaborative way throughout the whole process, responding to what we would bring or suggest or had possible to bring to the table, and then suggesting ways to kind of transfer that to the form of radio. And one of the suggestions of Kevin was for us to go back to the place where the project began. And as Kate said, to kind of dramatize the beginning of this Department of Ophthalmology. So the radio essay form for us in a way then offered both scope to become a kind of dramatization of the story of how the Department of Ophthalmology began, but also a radio essay in that we had 6 contributors from different disciplines and fields who we sort of speculatively put forward as the faculty of this Department of Ophthalmology. So we went back to the place where the project began, the Slide Library in Trinity College Dublin, and this is a little excerpt from that space. I think it's really interesting that the theme of this conference or seminar is sonic spaces also, because that was really what we wanted to do with this return to the Slide Library, was go back to this sonic space that we felt was really, really at risk. So Kate and I both studied slides in university, but the slides that were used then are no longer in use in the same way. So I'll play a little excerpt here.
Louis Vierne was a celebrated French organist and composer who is really well known for the unusual circumstances of his death. It happened on an evening in June 1937 in Paris in the Notre Dame Cathedral, where he was the principal organist. Vierne was giving a recital, having already played there 1,750 times. He was almost finished his musical piece and was poised to end with 2 improvisations. He activated the stops he would use for the final section of the performance. Then he lurched forward so his foot came to rest on the low E pedal of the organ. At that moment, as a single bass note boomed out over the expectant audience, the celebrated musician passed away.
In any story, the ending is important. It's only when you reach it that the whole can be understood. In her book, Closure in the Novel, Mariana Turgovnik characterises the end of a story as the place where its point is most pressingly made.
The death of Louis Vierne is often presented as the redemptive finale of what had been a difficult life. But can the significance of endings for stories be so readily transposed to a human life with all its endless complexities? Even if Vierne himself did often say that his lifelong dream was to die at the console of the great organ of Notre Dame.
Ultimology is the study of endings. We're about to tell a story, the story of what happened when an artist, that's me, Fiona Hallinan, and a curator,
that's me, Kate Strain,
invented a previously non-existent field of knowledge dedicated to the study of endings, how things end, why things end, and what sometimes unconsidered or undervalued effects endings have.
And what happened when we tried to establish this field of knowledge within a university as a real and active site.
We called this the Department of Ultimology.
We're here in the Slide Library, where we both studied history of art and architecture a little over 10 years ago.
A room in the arts block of Trinity College Dublin, and the place where we first began to think about ultimology.
So we have Romanesque and Gothic in one area. We have old architecture over here, and then a lot of it by country, like General, Bruges, Cairo, St. Britain, Great Britain, St. Albans, Stourbridge. I think in a way the idea that for us studying history of art, that images travelled through slides and that we got to know most of the buildings or artworks that we learned so much about through slides is a really kind of vital key to understanding how we learned art history, how it was taught, and how knowledge about art historical events, monuments, paintings were produced in our brains. It was such a tactile experience because for every single thing we studied we had to root out and look up a slide.
And it was totally based in this room and in this place. Like even coming up the stairs there, I remembered the smell and the light and the feeling of the architecture. So as I mentioned there, Kevin suggested this idea of bringing us back to the kind of beginning point of the project and this physical space of the Slide Library. And I think that summarizes in some way what we would like to do with this project, and what we wanted to do with the radio essay was to kind of conjure this atmosphere of a space, a kind of hypothetical space. What would it be like if there was a place where you went to study endings? And so we invited 6 different contributors to speak to us for the radio essay. Maybe we could go through the names briefly of them. So there were 2 artists involved, or 3 artists involved. Isabel Nolan, who's a visual artist who spoke about ultimological anxiety. Jessica Foley, who's a researcher and artist who spoke about endings in technology in particular, and ideas of materiality or immateriality. She particularly spoke about undersea cables. Ross Perlin, who was the originator of the term ultimology, who spoke on endangered languages or the impossibility of languages becoming extinct. The artist Laura Nsengiumva, who spoke about the decolonialization of public space in Belgium. Dora Varga, who is an expert in endings of epidemics from a socialist perspective. And Salim Tajani, who's a student and protester who interrupts the radio essay at the end. So we wanted, as I mentioned, this format of radio essay to allow the voices of these people doing very, very important work to be underlined and platformed but also to play with this possibility of what would happen if you put all of these different voices and all of these different ideas together, linked by this sort of fragile or tenuous link of understanding endings. I would like to play another excerpt now from Dora Varga's particularly relevant excerpt, who speaks about the endings of epidemics.
Dr. Dora Varga researches the history of epidemics and global health from a socialist perspective. She spoke to us about the arc of epidemics and indeterminate endings in disease.
In my research, I tend to look at epidemics and vaccination, and this has brought me thinking to what happens at the end of a disease, at the end of an epidemic, and what happens after. So I started to think about this in a bit more structured way, and to think if we can challenge this epidemic narrative that is often presented to us. As Charles Rosenberg, a historian of medicine, has put it, it's like epidemics are like a play. There are 3 acts, as if when it's slowly unfolding and there's a crisis, and then it goes out with a whimper. But I'm very uncomfortable with that closed narrative that an epidemic or a disease ends and then that's it. The only human disease that had been eradicated is smallpox, and you needed that kind of ending a disease to drive that eradication program. And I don't think anybody would argue that we would want to have smallpox back. But even smallpox is a funny one, because it was an eradication program done in the Cold War context. So they kept vials of smallpox because there's this, there was this fear also of, if smallpox is eradicated and nobody is vaccinated against it anymore, it could be used as a biological weapon. So they kept vials of smallpox in freezers, both in the Soviet Union and in the United States. And this is sort of that mutually assured destruction doctrine of the Cold War living in the freezers right now. So the disease disappeared from the world, but it keeps living on in freezers, and the Cold War itself, which ended, keeps living on in these freezers in the shape of smallpox.
That was Dora Varga speaking on the endings of epidemics, and in the background, the soundscape created by Cuivi na Raghallaigh. Kate, maybe you could speak a little bit about that process.
I'd love to. So as primarily visual practitioners, Fiona as a visual artist and I myself as a visual arts curator, we were super excited with the idea of working on the radio and trying to communicate and figure out a way to communicate primarily through language and sound, when usually we're used to working very visually through exhibition making and object making. And so this was a really exciting opportunity for us. And having had very little expertise, or none in my case, of working in a way that's so dependent on sound, and sound as a communicative form as well as a kind of artistic vehicle, we decided to invite Cuivi na Raghallaigh to come and work with us and interpret some of the findings and research and information that we were trying to describe in a kind of improvised way, and then reflect this back to us through the score. So we commissioned Cuivi to compose a score for the entire hour-long drama. And he did this in a really beautiful and organic way. He came to the sound studio in the basement of RTE Radio, and he would listen to each of the excerpts and extracts from the contributors, and then he would improvise with the instruments that he had brought along a kind of track to mirror or clash with in some cases, or describe and articulate and pick out elements of what they were speaking about. So what we just heard with Dora Varga's story there, the sound that was kind of lying underneath it for so long then becomes suddenly kind of explosive, almost like a giant freezer breaking open, or a whale kind of reaching down under the sea. And one of the things that we loved about how Caoimhín worked with this is because his practice as a musician is so intuitive and responsive, he was able to have a kind of almost like a sonic conversation between the contributors' ideas and his own then musical interpretation.
I think we're just reaching the end of our time slot, but there's one.
You have time maybe for one more clip if it's a short one, maybe. It's always good to hear stuff.
Yeah, there's one tiny clip just because that sort of addition of working with Caoimhín O'Reilly, there were certain moments where I think that the words and the sound created reached this really beautiful synergy. So I wanted to play just a 1 minute clip. This is from Isabel Nolan's contribution.
Such a detail brings the reality of a final moment into frightening, sharp focus. Likewise, the micro-expressions of a painted face, the cast of a glance, or the curl of a lip, transforms our sense of the human pinioned in paint and subjected to our subjectivity. With such details, we are met with the suffering, the grace, the absent-mindedness, and the endless cruelty of humans, but also the sensitivity of the witness, the time taken to make a record and protract these small moments. I find in them a simple physical reassurance that the dead really used to be alive. And staring at these other painted people, we see not only them, but also a partial record of the regard with which the past world held itself, the world before we were born into its familiar grip. Walking away, we know not only that we will, like the subjects of these works, the clothing they wear and the furnishings that framed their lives, like the people who made them, we will one day not be here, but in the best possible sense, it will not matter. There is something very unusual and demanding about these moments of being in contradiction, of simultaneously being in intense proximity and at an unbridgeable distance to the sitter's present. To have one foot in the past and another in our future grave.
Okay, Isabel Nolan ending better than we could. And that was also a great sound engineering work by Damien Channels that we worked with on the Radio SA. Okay, thank you.
Terrific. I mean, I think it's worth noting that the Department of Ophthalmology audio drama is available on the RTE site, so people can and indeed very much should go and listen to the whole thing. It's a really wonderful piece of work. So thank you very much, Fiona and Kate.
Thank you.
And I see in the Q&A somebody is wondering why we heard about a poet but didn't hear his poetry. So, I mean, hopefully maybe Neris is in her little chat box there and we'll have a reading maybe from Langston Hughes or indeed Amiri Baraka before we say goodbye at the end. There's a little job if you choose to accept it. We'll get back to you on that one, Neris. Right now I'm doing that very odd thing. Jennifer O'Mara asked me to change hats at this point. So the next person I'd like to introduce is myself. My name is Luke Clancy and I'm a radio maker and currently produce RTE Lyric FM's daily culture feature, which is called Culture File. But I continue to have a long-standing collaboration with a group that first came together around the RTE Radio 1 series Sound Stories. So I wanted to tell you something about that practice. In fact, it involves a person who featured quite largely in Fiona and Kate's presentation there, Kevin Brew, who I guess I would say that without whom there would be a lot less culture on the radio. I've worked with him extensively and I began working with him as the first time I presented a show on RTE Radio 1 was with Kevin, and it was something we cooked up called Sound Stories, which was basically the idea was to look at a subject that we kind of an area of production that we knew wasn't quite music, but at the time didn't really have another name for. And I keep talking about expanded definitions, but we wanted to talk about culture that was on the radio, but that culture that was exclusively sound, but not music. And it was something, a little space that we'd become very interested, myself and Kevin. And we created the series called Sound Stories, which is on RTE Radio 1. There are links for all of these things, which perhaps Francesca is popping into the chat as we go along, but at least at the end, we'll have a lot of links for both the Department of Ophthalmology and anything I mention here. But Sound Stories was a series with a desire to explore an odd space. It came in through the years, we worked out, but the definition after that wasn't completely obvious. So we created Sound Stories to begin mapping out a little world and begin to enlarge our own expanding of what it was we were talking about. We created 4 series of Sound Stories, and that ranges from documentaries to little radio dramas to, I think, Amiri Baraka's, perhaps his first appearance on RTE Radio may have been when Neris introduced him on Sound Stories many years ago, I think. But around that time, we also began collaborating with the sound recordist Chris Watson, who many of you may know as a nature recordist and a general sound recordist who's worked on programs like the Chernobyl drama, but generally is interested in field recordings. And so that collaborative team came together on that collaborative team came together on Sound Stories many years ago, and since then has elaborated itself in various different ways. As I say, sometimes through radio drama, sometimes through series, and sometimes through standalone documentaries, all of which are kind of rooted in the idea of audio culture and storytelling. So the ones that I might point you to are a program called Skellig Calling, which looked at the sound and cultural world of Skellig Michael, which involved field recordings and storytelling from around the island and around the land there, which again was a collaboration between Kevin Brew, myself, and Chris Watson. And that team then also produced Lighthouse Stories, which looked at the sonic worlds of Irish lighthouses. And the culture that I suppose the Department of Ophthalmology would understand fully, which was that there was a culture of keepers of lighthouses who were being made redundant or moved to different desks as lighthouses around Ireland became automated. So we, with Chris Watson, myself and Kevin, went to various lighthouse recordings to find that unique sonic world that you get inside a kind of column of stone with a metal staircase, but also to hear from the people who had who had this craft and tradition that was about to be ultimized, was about to disappear. And that series is called Lighthouse Stories. It's available on the RTE site. Also, we created some dramas using the same material or investigating the same material. And I draw your attention to a RTE radio drama called The Vision Service, which is kind of an imaginary history of paramilitary resistance to the arrival of television in Ireland, which is actually a comedy and well worth having a little listen to. Most recently, we've been working on a program called Islands, which again is a sort of speculative fiction, a speculative travelogue of islands, both real and imaginary, and including sound recordings from various locations created by Chris, and also essays created by myself and Kevin Brew. So they're the things that led to what I'm doing now, which is, as I said, Culture File, which is a daily short feature program running on RTE Lyric FM and featuring a range of artists. And I like to use the definition that sort of comes from how people were beginning to think about sculpture at the end of the 1960s, that there was an expanded definition of culture, and Culture File was a way of looking at that. And I think that sort of in my head quite distinct from a program which is about the current affairs of culture, which is what you might go and see on the television, or go to the theatre to see. And this was more about the kind of the work that nourishes it, the process behind it, but also the research and ideas that were still live and maybe haven't turned into work itself. I suppose it's Culturefile is designed as a curatorial and collaborative area, and it's flexible enough to allow us to follow research as much as events, and to work with artists who are both exploring work that they're making, but also creating new work specifically for Culturefile, and which I think is something quite important, that it becomes a curatorial space rather than an announcement, and that the pieces themselves represent culture on the radio rather than a deferral of that, pointing to something else, pointing to a practice which is invisible in that context. And maybe today, I think we don't have a lot of time, but I would want to mention one artist who appears regularly on Culturefile, and I think resonated with some of Neris's the ideas Neris has talked about, which it is about the collaboration between artists and radio makers. And the person I want to draw your attention to is Jennifer Walsh, who some of you may know is a composer and artist who moves kind of very fluently between the concert hall and the gallery. And she was the artist behind Éisteach, which is the archive of the Irish avant-garde, which, if you don't know it, is very much worth seeing. In common with myself and Kevin, she's quite interested in imaginary, and indeed in the Department of Ophthalmology, quite interested in imaginative and imaginary and speculative work. And for Éisteach, she created a whole library of music for Irish avant-garde composers who never really existed, and sort of maintained that as a fictional entity. And you can see éisteach.org online. But during the pandemic, she created a diary of the plague year for Culturefile. And since the pandemic, if we are now in the since the pandemic situation, which not completely clear on, she's begun creating a series called Things Know Things, which looks at the limits of objects and people. And what I wanted to do, maybe to finish off today, is to just have a listen to one of her pieces. I thought we might listen to one of her pieces, and then after that, we will try and see if we can make the questions and answers work. So I'm going to try sharing my computer audio and then playing a piece of audio. You'd think it would be easy, wouldn't you? Let's see how all that goes.
For anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour, and think about deep time. I could think much more clearly when I was there. The habit stayed with me, and up until the beginning of the pandemic, I'd nip in to visit the dinosaurs whenever I could. Last week, as the museums finally opened up, I got to go back and visit the Iguanodon for the first time since February 2020. This was a momentous event after so long away. Everything about the trip seemed both the same and also oddly different. The Piccadilly line isn't stopping at South Kensington for the next year, so I had to get the Central there. The pedestrian subway from the tube station to the museums is closed, so I had to walk on the street. And no more strolling past the museum guards with a smile. I needed a mask, a QR code, and a timed entry ticket. Nevertheless, as I approached the museum, it felt like coming home. I was back. At last, after this terrible year, back at the NHM, back with the dinosaurs. A wave of emotion began building in me, and as we were processed through the one-way system and the socially distanced queue...
I think I've cut that out, actually. Sorry about that. I think maybe that clip might be a little bit too long for us, but anyway, I just wanted to give you a little sample of Jennifer Walsh's pieces, which she composes music for as well as writing and presenting. So I think we have a little bit of time for Q&A, and let's have a go at seeing what's in the other box over here. All our panelists are still here. So there's one question here, which is from Eve Patton, and she was asking if any of the speakers would like to say something about the implied or imagined radio listeners. Maybe Nerys, would you start with that for us? Because I guess in that appreciation index at the BBC, there's a very specific qualitative analysis of the listener. Who did they think they were broadcasting to, and were they kind of creating an audience, or just did they see themselves as catering to something pre-existing?
That is a great question. I'm thinking, I guess, there are loads of ways of thinking about this in terms of the BBC reports themselves. The third programme itself was seen as the University of the Air. Okay, so it's seen very much as the precursor to the Open University. People like Harold Pinter would have talked about how the third really, really impacted his thoughts about drama and thinking about sound as well. Also, I suppose my guy, DG Brightson, I'm calling him my guy because I've spent a lot of time in the archive with him, but he was not from an Oxbridge background as part of the RRP that his voice carried. And I think that crucially in thinking about issues of listening audience, you've got to address that idea of the demotic, the idiom, the idea of received pronunciation as well. And Brightson was crucial in getting working class voices onto the air. Now, whether they would have listened to themselves on the third programme or on the home service, which was seen as being a far more kind of common man audience. So the idea of audience is incredibly complex, and as you can see from the responses to Langston Hughes, you have Windrush happening at the same time that Hughes is broadcasting, so you've got this kind of added perception of race as well, which has largely been invisible in a lot of the readings of the third programme, if I can say that.
Great, thank you. Kate and Fiona, I suppose that's a kind of an interesting jump when you're straddling a kind of fine art practice and a broadcast radio practice. That maybe, I mean, maybe you'll fill me in on this, but maybe as in an arts practice, you're thinking less about the audience. You're not trying to figure them as much, or is that a misconception? Kate or Fiona?
Certainly from a curatorial perspective, I think a very important part of the job of the curator is to consider the audience, to try to, in a way, be responsible for what glues audience to artistic practice and vice versa. So kind of a mediation role. And so definitely it would be a consideration. But then the opportunity for us to...
Are you in a sense a buffer for the artist who isn't concerned with that?
In some cases, I guess some artists really want to have a kind of, or produce a kind of exchange with the audience and really imagine an audience for their work, multiple publics, not just one kind of specific public usually, but then other artists don't do that at all. So it really depends. I mean, when you're working with an artist who's dead, then of course you are the only mediation point apart from the actual artwork itself between their artistic practice and the audience. That can get really interesting. But living artists, I would say, do have a kind of do really acknowledge the fact of the audience and are curious about them in terms of how they work. Would you agree, Fiona?
Yeah, I suppose I would just add in response to the question that one of the things that was most exciting to us about bringing this project, which had been presented in some sense in a live physical gathering way, bringing that onto radio, what was really exciting for us was moving outside of our usual audiences. And I think that's something that is really important to us in this project, and radio really allows for, is this idea of people stumbling upon it, people hearing the words of Isabel Nolan that was just played at the end there, who may never go into a gallery to see her work. So for us, bringing that project, transferring a visual art or performance project onto radio was really exciting in what it offered in that way.
Fiona, did you feel yourself new constrictions when you started working in radio?
I found it really liberating.
Liberating.
Yeah, I think I just want to talk to people, and it was such a straightforward way of doing that. And I suppose, Luke, because Kevin Brew, that like it was just having a producer like that who facilitates and mediates and often puts up with loads of kind of sudden changes of heart or conceptual shifts or moments of inspiration, make everything very seamless and seem very easy as well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I can speak to personally there is that, is there something I feel there is about radio which is essentially more useful when it's collaborative? And I mean, Nerys was talking about a great collaboration that, opened the airwaves in a particular way, but it seems to mitigate against a kind of, any kind of heroic creator behind a piece. It becomes a much more relational experience and project. That sounds like a question, does it? I hope. Fiona.
I guess, the way you're saying that makes me think about the way that film traditionally works, where people have very specific roles. And in some cases, what we were doing had the benefit of those specific roles, but less constriction to them. So everybody had a specific role, but yet there was constant collaboration and cross-pollination of ideas.
Yeah.
There's also so much to be said for the kind of hospitable nature of radio, which has a real generosity in how it engages with people who receive it. So if I want to go and see, Jennifer, was it, for example, who goes to see the dinosaurs, she has to physically put her body in the same space. Whereas with radio, it meets you wherever you are in your ears. And that's such a kind of immediacy and such a intimate way of reaching an audience. I think there's obviously huge potential in that, which you're completely tapping into with your work, but it's something that I hadn't really thought about or encountered before doing the radio essay. I was purely exhibition making.
And then the sort of wonderful lack of budgetary constrictions as well, in that you can create that. No, it's not completely budget free, but that you can put yourself into a place with less than you can if you're making a film or you're putting on a kind of material based exhibition. I find that quite exciting, that you can create atmospheres.
So I wonder for both of you where that experience that you've just had leads. I mean, how will it go on to inform further practice?
Well, at the moment, Fiona's at the beginning of developing a film work, which I think will have a huge kind of audio element. Maybe, Fiona, you'd like to mention that.
Yeah, I'm making a film about an ending, a demolition of a building. And I think a really direct transference of this project will be a kind of focus on oral interviews in the filmmaking process and in the project itself. And not just in that project, but in, I think, our work generally with ophthalmology, is this idea, we started interviewing people, the interviews led to a conference, and then that led to this radio essay. And I think what Kate and I are seeing is like this idea of ophthalmology, it's really just seeding an idea and creating a space or a context or an atmosphere where it's safe to talk about these things that people may not get opportunities to otherwise. And interviews are very fundamental to that. And then we're also playing with different interview techniques that we specifically learned about through working in radio. So for example, the Schwartz technique, which maybe you're familiar with, Luke, this idea of a radio documentary maker, Stephen Schwartz, in the 70s developed a technique where he wanted to capture the atmosphere of an anatomic institute from a night guard that was working there. And he couldn't get him to kind of conjure that atmosphere without being there in physical space. So he asked the guard to lie on the ground in a dark room with a candlelight and to describe the space in the present tense. And this technique, I actually spoke to Kevin about it, and he said, oh yeah, we were doing that in the slide library. So it struck me that, there are these interview techniques, these ways of creating or conjuring an atmosphere used in radio very naturally and organically and necessarily. And how could that transfer then to other ways that we make records, that we make other oral histories, or that we record people's feeling of a time and place? And I think that's going to become a really important part of my practice anyway.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all very much. We are actually hitting up against the 8 o'clock bit, which is an absolutely deadly deadline, apparently. So thank you very much, Nerys Williams, Fiona Halnan, Kate Strain, and thanks to Jennifer O'Mara for organising this wonderful event. And thank you all, including Peter Cole in North Vancouver, British Columbia, who may be our most distant joiner, for joining us this evening. And thank you all very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.